stick it under.
Good morning. Good morning. Hello. My name is Megan McCafferty, and I work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in partnership with Andy and the campus leaders. I am thrilled to be here with all of y'all this morning. We are excited to share the findings of this report. Just a little bit about the Gates Foundation. We are missioned around the value that all lives have equal value. In the U.S., we believe that education is the way that people have opportunity to pursue a healthy and productive life. Our partnership with NCLC began as a need to elevate authentic voices as consumers of higher education. We know that the field recognizes that there's a greater need for that, and we produced this report in partnership to elevate where the student voice actually exists in the higher education space. So we hope that this data is going to be helpful to begin a conversation, and hope that campuses will see this as a stepping stone to start collaboration, even more so with student leaders. So wanted to officially hand off to the Executive Director of NCLC, Andy, who will get this program started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Before actually diving into the program, I have several thank yous to make sure we highlight as we get started. So first, I want to thank Megan and Travis and Nick at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all of their colleagues for making this project possible. I also want to thank the fantastic members of our technical advisory committee who really gave us fantastic insight and expertise as we got started a year ago to try to figure out how do you actually measure student voice. So I want to specifically thank Holly Chessman from ACE, Andy Launder from AGB, Mayanne Ireland from Achieving the Dream, Walter May from Reinhardt University, Ebony Zamani Gallagher from the Community College Leadership Program at University of Illinois, Brenda McKenzie from Vanderbilt University, and John Lozano from Indiana University. I also want to give a shout out to McGregor Obergfell, who provided fantastic research assistance at very critical times in our research process. And of course, I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning, both in person and to all of you tuning in online from around the country. As Megan said, I'm Andy McCracken. I'm Executive Director and co-founder here at National Campus Leadership Council. And I want to briefly share a little bit about some of our story as NCLC. So we got started back in 2012 really with the belief that today's decisions disproportionately affect today's students, and that if student leaders were more active and more effective in shaping those decisions, solutions will better serve students in the long run. I was a student body president myself at American University, go Eagles, but my term ran from May to April, and I would say it probably took me until about March to figure out exactly the power of the platform that I had. And NCLC is here to try to inspire that light bulb moment for students much earlier in the process to lessen the learning curve and really make sure that they're equipped with the skills, the networks, and the expertise to be really effective in their roles for the short amount of time that they have them. Since 2012, NCLC has worked with more than 2,100 student body presidents at more than 500 colleges and universities, providing them the expertise and skills to be really highly effective advocates and community leaders. As issues have emerged and new issues have emerged, we've seen truly dedicated and passionate work from a really impressive group of student leaders year after year who are very actively trying to come up with innovative, creative solutions to problems facing their classmates and peers. And that's nothing new in our history. Students have been drivers and champions of political and cultural awakenings throughout modern history. And in many ways, there's a sense that today's frequent campus unrest really echoes what we saw half a century ago. Today, as students sound the alarms of emerging crises, institutional decision makers face increasing pressure to respond to a wide range of challenges, such as curbing costs while maintaining financial stability, curbing campus sexual assault, addressing a growing mental health crisis, balancing free speech rights with student safety, among many, many other pressing challenges. And while many institutions are approaching these problems very thoughtfully in an inclusive manner, many still seem to be living in a state of either pre-crisis or actually sitting in a crisis. And as University of Maryland College Park president recently stated, I think very well, a lot of colleges seem to be sitting atop dormant volcanoes. So that's, I think, why we have names like Mizzou, Michigan State, Silent Sam, that conjure up these challenging images of often ugly moments that are really fueled by what many would categorize as student revolt. But some see progress in that. Others see just general unrest. But we know that those don't tell the full story. And we know that it's not the full picture. So with Student Voice Index, we wanted to set out to catch a glimpse of what the state of student voice is beyond the headlines, beyond the hyperbole of today's political environment. It's a foundational study designed to better understand the formal and informal ways students shape institutional decision-making in higher education as more of the day-to-day, less headline-grabbing issues are addressed on college campuses. So we focused primarily on student body presidents. We conducted a survey of SGA presidents supplemented by document analysis at a diverse array of more than 200 institutions, including public, private, community colleges, 2 years, 4 years, and minority-serving institutions. And I just want to quickly note, we're going to use student body president and SGA president interchangeably. Sometimes they're known as student council presidents. At the end of the day, we're talking about the chief student representative to non-student decision makers and stakeholders in the higher ed community. So in this first iteration of Student Voice, we wanted to map how institutions make decisions and identify exactly how SGA presidents, as that chief student representative, are interacting with those processes. Student body presidents serve a very unique role, and that involves both sort of informal interactions as well as formal roles in shared governance from time to time. They're almost always elected by the student body, and we have data on voting rates now, thanks to this great research, which is exciting. It tells us we have a lot of work to do. It's about, 22% or so around the country, which, I don't know, down ballot races in a midterm year, that's pretty much how our country does as well. So we all need to do better. But they're almost always elected into that role, and as a result have a strong sense of what the issues really are, affecting their classmates, affecting themselves, affecting the campus at large. They often have real authority over real money and budgets. The average budget is well over $500,000 for student governments around the country. And they have a really unparalleled access to both the decision makers and influencers in the higher ed space at the campus level, system, state, and federal levels. So, with that in mind, I want to share a short video we put together that tries to capture some insights and reflections from students themselves, from student body presidents, reflecting on what student voice is to them and what it means for their institution. And I want to note there are going to be some stats that are interspersed throughout the video. You don't need to take copious notes yet. My colleague Lindsay will go into all the findings in greater detail. So just take in what the students are saying, and we'll get started with the rest of the program and dive into the research after the video.
Student voice is a diverse set of opinions. I think it's when students of all different identities, different backgrounds are being listened to. I think that there are a lot of students who feel as if they don't have a voice because they don't have as much representation as other students. So I think to amplify that voice or to ensure that there is real student voice, it's that it is the most diverse, dynamic set of voice and represented students possible.
When students raise their voice, when students speak out, not only do they articulate their needs for now, but once those needs are resolved, then it gives the people who come after them the opportunity to live in a better environment, and so they could go on to solve other problems. If the student's voice is not heard, if the student's voice is not found to be effective, then it will be the same problems that's going down from generation to generation to generation.
Making sure that you're able to capture that moment in history as the students of today that say, this is what's working for us, this is what's not, this is what we're able to celebrate, and this is what we're able to change. But you gotta trust that they have a real issue there, but you gotta trust what they're saying is good. Maybe it's bad, but you gotta trust that they have something there of substance. And if you don't, it's really fragile, because then if there's an issue that you see coming on your campus, and you could have said, well, the students saw that, why don't we listen to the students?
If we care about what the students have to say, only then can we achieve the optimal student experience.
Yeah. Have to give applause to Jave, who did the video for us. As we get started and reveal the rest of our research, there are a couple stats at the beginning there that try to capture some of those 5 major indicators for how we can start benchmarking student voice across the country. And so just to quickly run through the rest of the agenda, you have the agendas in front of you, but my colleague Lindsay will come up and dive into the details of the findings, and then we'll have a panel discuss the implications and their vision for the future of student voice in higher education, and then we will wrap up with some discussion about what happens next, and if there's time, we can take a few questions as well. So with that, I'm very excited to invite to the stage Lindsay Templeton, who's been leading this research with us. She joined us 51 weeks ago. Next week is her 1-year anniversary with NCLC. And in that time has really taken this very abstract concept of measuring student voice, has turned it into something substantive and tangible that will, I believe, really reshape the future of higher education. So we're very fortunate. She's taken time out of her doctoral program at University of Maryland and their higher ed program to bring her expertise and talents to make this project a reality. So without further ado, Lindsay, please walk us through it.
All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Andy, for the very kind introduction. Almost 1 year at NCLC, and it's very exciting to celebrate that anniversary by sharing the results of our Student Voice Index research and to really hear firsthand from some of the student body presidents about their perception of student voice. All right, so when we first started the project, we had to define student voice. It's a complex idea. And so we built on existing literature and research, and with the help from our Technical Advisory Committee and Campus Alumni Council of former student body presidents, we developed the following definition. Student voice is students' agency to exercise and institutional inclusion of thoughts, ideas, and opinions in shared governance and related processes and environments that drive decision-making. So there are two main branches to this definition. The first is that students feel agentic to participate in decision-making at their institution. And the second is that institutions actually take those thoughts and opinions into consideration. Throughout our research, we've asked student leaders about their own definition of student voice, and you'll see some examples of that on the screen. I'm always impressed by how they define this complex idea, and so it's something that really motivates our research. After defining student voice, we needed to operationalize it, and so we developed a rubric with 4 key metrics: access, role, empowerment, and influence. By access, we refer to student leaders' access to decision-making entities at their institution, like governing boards and institutional leaders. By role, we refer to the rights and responsibilities that students are granted on those entities. By empowerment, we refer to the institution's investment in students' abilities to participate in decision-making. For example, do they offer trainings for student leaders to really learn about the inner workings of the institution? And finally, by influence, we refer to the influence that student leaders feel they have to affect change at their institution. So not just do I have a voice in decision-making, but does my voice really matter? These 4 metrics taken together allowed us, again, to operationalize this definition of student voice. But the question is still, how do you measure student voice? So we employed 2 main methods for data collection. The first was a comprehensive survey of student body presidents that asked about their experiences with student leadership and institutional governance. We sent the survey to hundreds of student body presidents across the country and received responses from over 200 student leaders at 2-year, 4-year, public, private, and minority-serving institutions, which really allowed us to capture a variety of perspectives from different institutional types. We then collected publicly available documents, policies, procedures, and bylaws that allowed us to triangulate our findings from the survey and really understand how students had access to decision-making and the roles that they were offered on these bodies. After collecting all of that data, it was time for analysis. We conducted an exploratory factor analysis to identify the 5 key indicators that you saw in the video, 5 indicators that really comprise this idea of student voice. These indicators allowed us to understand the perception of student voice at their institution, the perception of relationships with institutional leaders, and the respect that students felt from decision-making groups at their institution. You see that it captures cooperation, input, respect, opportunity, and voice. So we used these 5 indicators to develop what we termed a composite voice variable. And we used this variable to test the other data points and really identify the key factors that impacted student voice. And that's the exciting part. So our 4 key findings as a result of that analysis. The first finding is that engagement with the governing board matters no matter the role. We asked student body presidents about their engagement with the governing board. Some reported serving as members of the board, others as representatives to the board, and still yet some who had more informal engagement or interactions. But ultimately, the title didn't matter. It was being involved and engaged with the governing board that significantly impacted student voice. We learned a few other things about engagement with the governing board. We asked student body presidents about their experiences interacting with the board and found that those who felt the board was responsive or supportive also had stronger student voice. And you can see here that just about 2/3 of student leaders reported that the governing board was supportive or responsive. We also found that training was important to engagement with the governing board, that feeling prepared to take on that role was an element of student voice that was really important to student leaders. Yet only 22% of student body presidents who had engagement with the governing board were actually trained for that role. And of those who were trained, a very small percentage actually found the training to be effective. So an area for us to really capitalize on is thinking about how we train student leaders to be engaged with the board. Ultimately, this first key finding, that engagement with the governing board matters no matter the role, suggests that access to the governing board meetings is important, and having a role signals importance but may not be the key factor impacting student voice. That leads us to our second key finding. Speaking rights lead to stronger student voice. So in addition to asking about engagement with the governing board, we really wanted to understand that key metric of role. What kinds of rights and responsibilities are student members afforded on the governing board? And really here we were seeking to understand if student members were granted the same level of rights and responsibilities as the other members of the board. So if a board member can speak at any type of meeting or vote on any decision of the governing board, do student members have the same level of speaking rights and voting rights? And what we found was that student body presidents who had speaking rights had stronger student voice than those without. Ultimately, there were 3 groups within our survey. The first, student body presidents who had both speaking rights and voting rights. The second, student body presidents who only had speaking rights. And the third, those who had neither speaking rights nor voting rights. There were no institutions in our study that had voting rights but no speaking rights offered to students. And what's interesting here is that we didn't see the same trend for voting rights, but the key finding that having speaking rights impacts student voice is important to note and perhaps suggests that student body presidents want to be engaged in the conversation earlier in the process. They want to be involved in shaping the discussion, and that's more important than being able to raise your hand or say yes when the vote comes to play. Our third finding is that relationships with institutional leaders matter, particularly with the Chief Student Affairs Officer. We recognize that many decisions in higher education are at the governing board level, but others are concentrated in or facilitated by key administrative and academic leaders. And so we asked student body presidents about their experiences with and relationships with these individuals, like the Chief Executive Officer or President, the Chief Academic Officer or Provost, the Chief Financial Officer, and the Chief Student Affairs Officer. And we ultimately found that meeting with these individuals was really important to student voice. Now, the frequency of these meetings varied. So from the CFO to the CAO, we saw a difference in how frequently student body presidents were meeting with these individuals. But ultimately, it was the Vice President of Student Affairs, or the Chief Student Affairs Officer, where the frequency mattered the most. We found that student body presidents who met biweekly or weekly with the Vice President of Student Affairs had stronger student voice than those who met once per semester or less. And only 1 in 9 student body presidents did not meet with this leader at all. Knowing that the Vice President of Student Affairs was the most significant, this meeting frequency for student voice, we looked further into this, and we found that meeting effectiveness, satisfaction with the frequency of meetings, and satisfaction with meeting outcomes were also significantly important for student voice. And what's interesting here is that we saw that student body presidents were relatively satisfied with the meeting effectiveness and the frequency of the meetings, but weren't as satisfied with meeting outcome. Overall, this third finding, that relationships with institutional leaders matter, particularly the Vice President of Student Affairs, suggests that meeting with institutional leaders offers student body presidents access to decision makers, a place to discuss important issues, and an avenue to share their voice. That leads to our fourth and final key finding. Strong perception of influence leads to strong voice. So while we looked at relationships with institutional leaders, decisions of the governing board, we also wanted to know how individual student body presidents felt about their influence to affect change at their institution. And we found that it mattered a great deal to student voice. Ultimately, feeling as though students had the power to influence change, like they were influential to create that change, was a strong predictor of having high student voice. We found that just over half of student body presidents in our study felt very or extremely influential to affect change on their campus. And so we wanted to know what factors impact perception of influence. And we found two main findings. The first was related to access to meetings of the governing board. So while we had looked at student body presidents' interaction with the board, here we wanted to know if students more broadly had access to meetings of the board. And at institutions where students could attend all meetings of the governing board, the student body president had higher perception of influence than at institutions where students could only attend some or none of the meetings of the governing board. Additionally, feeling respected by the governing board significantly impacted perception of influence. And what's interesting is that we also found that feeling influential on decisions of the governing board, any type of decision, was significantly correlated to student voice. So here we see a really strong connection between perception of influence for student body presidents and perception of their voice. This last key finding, that stronger influence leads to stronger voice, tells us that having access to decision-making and a voice in the process is important, but is something that may be strengthened when students feel as though they have the influence to affect change. So with those four findings in mind, our research suggests that access, role, empowerment, and influence are all important parts of student voice in institutional decision-making. We offer recommendations based on engaging students, evaluating existing paths to decision-making, and truly listening to student concerns. We're very excited to release the research today. I know myself, especially after this last year, and you'll find in the Student Voice Index report more detail about our findings, our methodology, areas for future research. But I also want to make note, as we all do as a team, I think, that student voice varies by institution, and we saw that firsthand through our research. And so as part of our research, we're also conducting in-depth case studies to really understand and see some of our key findings and student voice firsthand. So after wrapping up the research findings, I'm excited to preview our first case study video of The Ohio State University as one example of student voice in action.
Students really do take a very active role in our Senate. I mentioned 19 committees. The vast majority of those committees have student members. The few that don't are very faculty focused. For the most part, students are in every committee, and I feel like that's where students have a big voice.
Working with administrators at Ohio State has been wonderful. I've become a lot of my best mentors. We met with Dr. J every single week, so our Senior Vice President of Student Life. Meet with her every single week. She's in her 10th year here, so she's been through 10 years of USG leaders and knows what goes well at the university and doesn't go well. That's been amazing. President Drake, we meet with the president and the provost once a month or as needed, or on phone calls if there's things happening. This week, actually, is the 50th anniversary of the protest that happened on campus in 1968. Students were expelled from that, and his idea was to bring them back on campus and let's talk about it. And so, like, he clearly has a passion for student voice and, like, making sure that students know what that means at Ohio State.
We have about 90-ish unique students and roughly 130 unique positions. So that includes 26 undergraduate senators on the university senate, and then the rest of those positions, the other 110 being on all sorts of various committees in the university.
How do we then communicate to students just how unique our position is? Once you start to have a more personal conversation with a student and explain just how our structure works and how we actually have seats at the table and seats with votes too, they're better able to understand that the real power of student government is even outside of what happens in cabinet and General Assembly. And with that, they're more inclined to share their stories and share their experiences and their ideas for how we can do a better job. I think a lot of times, regardless of the seat at the table, a lot of times students just want to be heard and have somebody listen to their experience and their story and know that there's somebody who has their back and is continuously advocating for them. And that's something that we've definitely seen at Ohio State.
It really starts with a real commitment to our students and the student voice and understanding that this is really about student development. And so it really starts internally. We know that this is important work. And so, yes, we do look at it as a national way of modeling to others that you can engage students, and that it's not only that you can, that you should, that you must, and that when you do, it changes not only the environment, but it changes the work that we do and the success that you should have, because student engagement is really why we do this work.
I almost think that for much of the university, it's just in the water, and we don't think, oh, we're doing something really unique and different. We've been doing it for a long time, and so I don't think we recognize it necessarily as unique as it is.
We have 2 student members of the Board of Trustees who have voting rights, and they're looked at as equal peers, being able to have candid conversations and trust that students will be understanding towards the limitations that affect Ohio State or that affect higher education overall, and being able to be treated as equal partners in this decision-making process, both in the short and long term. And I think the long term is a key component that sometimes is forgotten because, as students, we aren't going to be here 50 years from now. But at Ohio State, we still had a seat at the table when we were starting to negotiate this 50-year energy privatization contract or a parking deal or different things like that, and that are going to impact students for generations to come.
With energy, I think the faculty weren't really paying attention until the students started raising hell a little bit about it, and then more and more people got involved. So I'd say they had a big voice in that whole decision, and they were on all the committees that did all the deciding too, by the way. Pay attention. Pay attention to the students. Listen to them. They work hard and they want to be taken seriously. And, I think that's it. You just listen to people and show a little respect.
Student voice is crucial because if you think about it, students are the front-end stakeholders in these conversations that we're talking about with higher education, with Ohio State in particular. And when you bring them to the table, and when you also do everything in your power to empower the other students who aren't at the table, that's how you get the best idea of what direction to move in and how to best create a path that these front-end stakeholders will then be able to best utilize.
It was really a pleasure to get to learn about the culture of student voice at The Ohio State University, and we look forward to future case studies at other institutions, which Andy will talk about towards the end of the program. But for now, it's my pleasure to transition to a panel on the state of student voice. And for that, I'd love to introduce Travis Rendell, Senior Communications Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I'm usually introduced as the guy who follows Megan McCafferty around to things, and I'm totally okay with that. It is really exciting to be part of this, and congratulations to NCLC for the first ever Student Voice Index. We're really, really pleased with this, and we hope that you are as well. You know, one of the things that we are trying to take Bill and Melinda around to campuses around the country to see what higher education looks like in day-to-day life and on the ground, and we haul them around to lots of different meetings. The ones they want to focus on the most, and the ones where I've watched the most energy go through them, is when they sit down with students, is when they experience and get to ask those questions. I remember Bill playing with a chat bot with students at Georgia State, and he looked like a kid in a candy store. Probably because there was technology involved. But they really feel deeply about the students and what they experience. And as Megan alluded to in her remarks, we at the Foundation are about, in higher education, creating student-centered institutions. That hasn't always been the culture in higher education, but we are working with colleges and universities to change their culture, to change how they operate, what they deliver, so that it puts the student at the center, that the student is the purpose for their existence. And I think that's especially important when you look at the dramatic changes that we've seen in who today's college students are. You've probably seen some of the data recently where 75% of all students have some characteristic that we would consider non-traditional. They work, 2/3 of our students work either part or full time. More than 1/4 of them have kids of their own. 40% are 25 or older. You know, those are characteristics that often when we interact with legislators and with governing boards, people tend to carry around that idea of the 18-year-old with a backpack that mom and dad dropped off for a 4-year experience. And knowing who our students are and what their needs are is a really important element of our discussions and why student voice matters now more than ever. And I'm really pleased to be able to help facilitate a discussion with 3 leaders who have seen this, lived this, and do this. And I'm especially pleased that it's all women, because seeing women leadership in higher education is one of the most heartening and inspiring things that I think this enterprise could experience. So to my far right is Valentina Fernandez, the student body president at The American University here in Washington. We found out earlier this morning that Valentina and I are neighbors. We live in the same building. So good thing she hasn't seen me when I come back from my run. To her left is Shamina Merchant, starring in the video, student body president of The Ohio State University. And to her left is Dr. Meryl Swartz, a friend and colleague from AGB Consulting, which is part of the Association of Governing Boards of Colleges and Universities. And Meryl and her team work with governing boards of all shapes and sizes around the country, trying to help those boards be better. And part of that is, what's the student role in helping a board be as effective as it possibly can be? So I'm going to start off with a question that I want to put to each of you, and we'll just come down the line. And then after that, we'll just shake things up and get a little chaotic. But how do you define student voice? You know, we hear this phrase, and the research kind of unpacks those 5 dimensions. But for you personally, especially in your experience as a student body president, Valentina, what does that mean to you? And what does good look like when you think about student voice?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with the definition that NCLC provided to all of us. I think the biggest component for me is the perception of influence, and feeling that it's mutual, feeling that you can go to university officials and leadership with ideas, with concerns, but also feel that they can go to you when they're experimenting with new processes, new systems. And I think what good looks like is really allowing and seeing students, not just students in student government roles, having those, you know, whether they're affinity group student leaders, whether they're small organization leaders, also having access to a lot of the similar roles and allowing room for innovation. So letting students take risks and really own what the projects are that they're taking on.
I'd agree. And at Ohio State, I'd echo exactly what Valentina said. And in the various meetings that we have successful ones, and those are the ones where we're treated as equal partners. And I think In particular, because of the relationship that's developed over time, oftentimes I start to get calls from administrators saying, hey, this happened on campus, what do we do about it? How can we make sure that students know and are aware of the resources at their fingertips? And kind of shifting that dynamic to see that you're an equal peer and you're a key stakeholder in this overall process leads to a stronger student voice.
From the perspective of governing boards, I'd say that it means that you have an affirmative responsibility to reach out and get input from key campus constituencies and give voice to students in formulating policies and understanding the priorities and issues of the campus. And a small percentage of governing boards have a student representative on that board and have that opportunity to hear from that student representative, but that's not enough. You have an affirmative responsibility to communicate what the board is doing to the campus, to reach out to students, and to provide opportunities for input in the policymaking process. And it may not just be a board committee, it may be other task forces, entities throughout the life of the institution, not just when the board convenes, but to ensure that that bridge is there from the board to the campus community and to provide opportunities for those voices to be heard.
A quick follow-up question on that. When you've articulated definitions of good, what have been some of your steps? What have you had to do as leaders and advisors in pushing your respective campuses and boards toward good? What actions are you really taking, and what do you see as some priorities for yourselves in getting to that definition?
I think something that's helped me personally is just being informed. I think you can have students who have perceived power, who have perceived influence, but if they're not really aware of how larger operating systems work and how decisions are made at large, whether it's how budget processes work, how strategic planning is created, like how is a board agenda formed, things like that have really helped me in feeling that I'm almost able to speak the same language as someone that has been in the field of education for 30 plus years rather than me as a 21-year-old student. I think there's a need for that a little bit more. I think I come from a unique position where I served as the student trustee on the board before serving currently as student body president. So I've been able to see sort of how a finance committee operates, how to create ongoing conversations with the board chair and things like that, but that's not normally the case.
And I'd add to knowing who your audience is and knowing how to become prepared and make a particular topic a priority. And so some of the issues that we deal with at Ohio State are issues that administrators are also passionate about, but just given the landscape of their portfolio and of their responsibilities, it's hard to make certain elements a priority. And so if we're willing to put in the time, do the research, bring data to the table, if that's what is going to be a tool that will help make these conversations more receptive, knowing how to bring those pieces to the table and put in the work outside of the room as well to move these conversations along to the next steps.
I was struck by how a smaller percentage of student trustees felt that they were properly, effectively prepared for the role. And to me, that talked to the responsibility of appointing authorities, the board, to do really good orientations. And it'll benefit student trustees, but it'll benefit all trustees, really orienting board members, new board members to their role, helping them understand what it is to be a fiduciary. I think that most trustee orientation is a brain dump about the institution. Here's how many whatever we have. Here's the role of the CFO, the provost, and so on. And you meet the cast of characters, very important people in the cabinet, but you don't necessarily talk about what does it mean to be a member of the board, to serve as a fiduciary, to the construction of the composition of the committees and the charge to each. And it takes a whole year to learn that job. And for most student trustees, your year's over. You have 1 year term.
Well, you gave me the perfect segue to my next question, and we did not script this, which I'll start with you, Meryl, and then Valentina, Shamina, jump in. When you think about the issues that are facing colleges and universities today, where is student voice most urgently needed and useful?
I don't know that there's an issue where it's not important when you're talking about higher education, because it's all about the students. So that one's a really tough one. In my role in consulting, we often get called in when things aren't working so well. So there's been a vote of no confidence, or the board are very divided on issues. Campus climate is one of them, having an inclusive climate that is really welcoming to all students, whether they're full-time, part-time, minority, white. You need to have an inclusive campus climate, and that's been a very divisive issue for a lot of institutions. I'll say that one's number one.
Yeah. Valentina, Shamina?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think one of my personal biggest frustrations is when I see university leaders only seeking student input if the problem has the word student in it. So it's student campus climate. Students don't feel, there's at American, at all sorts of institutions, there's been cases of issues of inclusion and race and things of that matter. But I think, going along with what was just being said, there needs to be more of a macro level thinking. So are students engaged in provost searches? Are they engaged in decisions that typically administrators wouldn't think of an average student, but will have direct impacts on whether it's curriculum, on whether it's financial aid systems and things like that?
And I think at Ohio State, our structure, we have a university senate that has several committees that touch everything from our relationship with the CODA bus line in Columbus to the Senate Fiscal Committee overall. And these are not quite at the level of the board, but they kind of look at details at a more granular level. What are the day-to-day implications of decisions that are made, and having students at that table and being able to facilitate these conversations that will ultimately end up at the board, I think is absolutely critical, because you've considered all of your options in those meetings. And
it recognizes too the opportunity that student leaders have. Don't wait till the sausage has already been made in the policy-making pipeline and it comes to the board for a vote. Be present, have an input in those other campus bodies that are formulating policy that will be approved or not at the board level. Sounds like you're very involved.
Well, I think the key focus that was highlighted was exactly what you said, in getting students in from the very beginning. And so we can address these issues before they become a bigger problem and are implemented and just approved or not approved at the board level.
I want to shift a little bit to everybody's favorite topic, which is money. And we know that students are paying a greater share of the cost of their education. And I guess the question is, as they pay more, are their expectations of their voice and their say rising? And if that's the case, should colleges and universities be thinking differently about student voice and its role in decision-making on campuses? So I'll kick it to you first, Valentina, but everybody else just feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think it's what I usually tell students is you're making an investment in a university by paying however much it is you're paying, so you should expect a level of investment back. And I think part of that comes with if you feel unsatisfied with some aspect of your student experience, whether it's academic, whether you feel that there's a lack of support from campus, whatever it is, you need to make that heard. And I think there is an expectation. I'm paying, and beyond the hard skills that I should be able to graduate college with, looking at employment, everything like that, I think there's also, I need to make the most of my experience while I'm in college, and part of that is making sure that I'm able to individualize it and shape it along the way.
I'm a business major, and so when you think about introducing a new product to the market, their goal is that consumers will be receptive of this product and be able to use it for its intended purpose. But before releasing that product, they conduct studies to make sure, they do focus groups to make sure that this is really what their consumers want to see. And I think that same principle applies to education because of the financial aspect. And because providing this service of education, but are you doing it in the most effective way, and are you educating your students for lifelong citizenship at a global landscape? I think is really critical to use that same model.
The decision to get a college degree is still one of the best investments a young person, a person can make. There is a great return on investment for getting a college education. It changes lives. One of the things that I worry about is the way in which student financial aid dollars are awarded and whether they're being used to meet financial need as opposed to other goals of the institution, and whether full need is being met so that it isn't so that cost isn't a barrier. Who isn't on that campus who should be because they can't afford it? I think that that's a big issue for policymakers, boards, and others, so that access isn't restricted, and that students aren't dropping out because they can't afford that fourth year. They aren't able to finish their degrees. So I think that those are some of the big policy-making issues that I worry about in terms of cost.
I'm going to pause our regularly scheduled programming just very briefly because we've been joined by a special guest. Former U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan is in the room. So Mr. Secretary, we want to welcome you. Thank you for what you do for all of us and for students in particular. You have the floor if you want to say anything, but Gabby Gomez did say keep it brief.
Welcome.
So Shamina, we were talking about as I started out how diverse the student population is, and that we had this old notion of the 18-year-old with the backpack getting out of the station wagon. That's not the reality. Have you seen in your time in student government and now as a leader how that impacts your thinking about how to reflect and represent the voice of students to your leadership, and Valentina as well? And then Meryl, in working with boards, you and I were talking before we got started today about the average age of board members and their frame of reference. What role does this changing student demographic have in this issue of student voice and student leadership? And so Shamina, I'll start with you, but everybody feel free to jump in.
To begin, I'd say even within my time at Ohio State, the landscape has changed significantly within even student government. And so started off my freshman and sophomore year, and there was larger conversation about the representation of student government was not actually representative of all of the demographics of the university. And that conversation has shifted to also include non-traditional students. You cited that statistic. At Ohio State, we have regional campuses, and we don't always do enough of a job of also connecting those students and their voices and their experiences overall to within the committees. And so I'd say that is an immense focus this particular year. And because of some of the work done by previous administrations, we've also made sure that new leaders at the administrative level are focused on these issues as well. And so from our perspective, for the first time, we're going to be traveling to regional campuses. We are focused on engagement in particular, so we're going to different student organizations that represent particular issues, because ultimately, those are your subject matter experts who have actually been through these experiences and can speak to their implications as well.
I definitely agree that it's also a challenge for us, and a challenge for me personally as a traditional, straight out of high school going into an undergrad career. It's difficult to recognize, the student that took a couple years off, that may have a family that is working full time while also attending college. I think something that I've been trying to be a little bit more intentional about is when university leaders reach out for lists of students, whether they're conducting focus groups, whether they're a breakfast with the board, whatever it may be, always trying to include a non-traditional student, trying to include transfer students in the mix as well, because it is a different set of experiences, and I think it actually would add a lot of value to an institution if they were more included, because typically you have students that have either worked before and are like, this has worked in a different workplace and it's not working here, or students that come from different institutions that are also able to bring in different perspectives of what was working back home in their previous institution, what they'd like to see here, where the disparity is. And I think with that, there also creates, I think, non-traditional students have different needs. So because they have families, because they're working full-time, whatever it may be, There are just simply more support systems that offices of campus life, that offices of academics need to be providing, and I still think we haven't quite figured out what that is. But when I think of non-traditional students, and I think it's changing rapidly at every institution, but I also think of a lot of students that typically have been left out of conversations. So I think of first-generation students, I think of students of color, students, low-income students that typically, higher education has been so restrictive and elitist in their practices. So I'm also trying to think about how are we bringing those students into the conversations, and that's part of the reason why I think of student voice as such a crucial part, because as a low-income student, as a first-generation student, I know that voice has not always been at the table.
But boards are responsible for the policies overall for their institutions and really need to, colleges and universities are old, long-standing parts of our society, and that's their charm and value, but it also presents a lot of challenges. They need to look at full-year course offerings so that you can go throughout the year part-time, different times of day, in person, online, respond to the changing demographics of students and the way in which people want to get an education. One of the startling stats for me was that more of the courses taken online are taken by students who are residential than not. Mm-hmm. They just want the anytime, anywhere convenience in order to use their time well and do other things. So I think that's an important thing. The point I think you wanted me to get at was that the characteristic of boards, as this isn't a flattering way to say it, but pale, stale, and male. They're older white men, and that is the predominant demographic. It is changing, and about a third of the seats on boards are women in both public and independent institutions. The percentage of minority is lower than that. That needs to change. I think that boards need to look around the table, appointing authorities need to consider, how does your board look and how does that reflect the communities that you serve, and do you have the voices at the table, not just age or student body, but demographics of your community to understand the needs of the people you serve.
Well, and to quickly follow up on that, and to your earlier point, how much of a role is there in board orientation? You were mentioning, sometimes we just give them the snapshot of the campus, but how much of a role in orientation is there to build that understanding of this is what our student population is, and as a result of having X% of first-generation students or X% of your students who are working part or full-time, these are some of the issues you'll face. I mean, to what extent is that part today of the orientation process, and is that an area where there should be some improvement moving forward?
It's an important part of orientation, but it's also what I would say an important part of continuing board education. Some of the best boards, I think, build in a plenary session at every board meeting just to learn, just to understand the higher education industry and to focus on that with guest speakers, with experts, so that at every board meeting, they're continually staying up to date and being forward-looking, being strategic.
So one of the things that was really interesting as I looked at this was this distinction, and Lindsay touched on it earlier, of speaking rights relative to voting rights in the board context. And I was fascinated to see that speaking rights mattered really significantly more, in opinion, than voting rights. Because in some ways, logic might lead you in a different direction. So I want to start with you, Valentina. Why do you think that's the case? And what, in terms of good speaking rights and really strong speaking rights, what does that look like with a board?
Yeah. So I'll provide a little bit of context first. So at American University right now, so the student trustee has full speaking rights, and the student body president is able to speak when they prepare a report in advance to the Board of Trustees, and that's specifically related to campus issues. So I think the value of having speaking rights in a boardroom is being able to insert yourself in conversation, again, even if it's not specifically related to students. So even if it's not a conversation about campus climate, it's a conversation about finances. Okay, well, this is how it would impact these other factors that maybe we're not considering right now. This is how a student would perceive it. Well, are we thinking about how it might impact this population of students? So I think it gives that sense of autonomy. And I think it's also really important because there is that divide of what a boardroom looks like and what a college campus actually looks like as well. I think it's something that more universities should be doing. I think as far as voting rights, as student trustee, I didn't have any voting rights, but because I had full speaking rights, I felt that I still had that level of influence, which is why I defined the student voice as. So because I was still able to influence board members or feel that my voice mattered and that they were thinking critically about any input I was giving, I didn't feel like it was lacking, but I know that's not always the case.
And as some context, this will be the third year that our student trustees have full voting rights in addition to speaking rights. And even beyond just the general board conversations, being in executive session and being able to steer the conversation and get it to the end product that the board ultimately votes on, I think is the biggest important step. The voting rights, I think, to the student body signify just the culture that Ohio State wants to set in terms of showing that we see students as equal peers. But getting it to that end voting state is what I think covers the majority of the implications and amplifies the student voice.
Mm-hmm. Public institutions, I think, have a tradition of having more opportunity for input. They have a larger percentage of students serving as a student trustee, whether they're voting or non-voting. It's a much larger percentage on public boards. They also have public meetings. They have usually a session for public comment. So there's going to be an opportunity for the Student Government Association president or the student trustee or students at large to comment at most public board meetings. I think that independent colleges and universities have a very different tradition, a very different culture. They traditionally meet in closed session. But there's an opportunity for students to be members of committees of the board when allowed by the bylaws, and bylaws can be changed too. So having them as members of board committees, having presentations, having opportunities for board members to engage with student leaders and hear about concerns of the campus are many ways in which the student voice can be heard. To me, it's just an expectation that if you have an opportunity to speak, you have voice. And it's really an important part of it.
And a quick follow-up, you mentioned the difference between independent and public, but within that universe of where differences where students have voting rights versus where they don't, do you see any appreciable difference in board function?
At HED, we've been asked a lot about should boards have student trustees, and we get this question too about faculty and have a opinion about the fiduciary role and inherent conflicts of interest to have students or employees of an institution serve as voting in the members of the board. That said, I advise boards, if you have a student or faculty board member, make sure you orient them well and use them well and integrate them just like any other member of the board, treat them the same. It would be seen as a very hostile act to change the policy and remove a student or faculty board member. It's just, that's the culture of your institution, and it works well most places where this is the tradition. But we don't advise boards that don't have student or faculty board members to add them. We remind them of their obligation, their responsibility to be bridges to the campus community, to find ways to communicate affirmatively about issues that are coming before the board, about actions that have been taken by the board, to have opportunities for real input and communication, and to serve their campus community well.
Mm-hmm. So using what we've seen with these findings in the index, and I'll start with you, Sheena, what advice would you give to your peers about really boosting student voice and really leveraging it? And as you think about your experience so far, or even your experience in the remainder of your term, what are you or would you do differently because of what you know out of this?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing is to be trusting of yourself, right? And one of the pieces that we talk about is students being the front-end stakeholders in these decision-making processes. And with the Student Voice Index and the research that's come out, I think it really highlights why regular meetings, but actually ones that have tangible outcomes, are critical. And so we meet with our senior vice president weekly, but we haven't done as much of a strong focus on making sure that there is a clear outcome and we're on the same page about what those next steps look like. So that's something that I want to continue to focus on. As well, for my peers, I'd say just taking the extra mile to put together what is most important and showcase that in a way that is translatable to admin and showcases that you should be treated equally, I think is really critically important. So bring the evidence, like show that you've done your work, and that's how you'll be taken seriously as well.
I completely agree. I think to add on as what I would try to do with my peers, I think as student government presidents, if typically you're at an institution that values student input, you also get a bunch of requests to sit on committees, whether, things from like transportation to like IDs to like higher level searches, whatever it may be. I think also just being really mindful and intentional about making sure that it's not always the student government president, but other aspects of campus life that may have a more direct impact on whatever the committee's role is. Bringing in diverse student leaders into the table who may not sometimes be a part of student government, I think is something really, really important, because as I said earlier, for me, like student voice goes beyond just your traditional student leaders. It's listening to your traditional student leaders and traditional student leaders having access to the main student affairs person, whatever it may be, but also making sure that any student that is working to enhance the student experience has access to that as well in some regard.
Great points, Valentina. That outreach, that ability to communicate well and provide opportunities to hear voices from the entire campus community so that you understand student needs well is very important. So communication strategies for the board to be able to hear and to inform the campus community about board action. The other would be improve your orientation of new board members, all board members, not just the students, but make that really a point of pride for how people are onboarded.
I think that is a great summation of things, and what I've heard in this conversation is information matters. Orientation and preparation for your role, whether you're a board member or a student leader, matters. Early engagement matters. It's not waiting until the final decision is on the table. And I think, Shamina, you really hit it well. Instinct matters. Knowing who your students, knowing who you're leading and who's following, and really understanding what their needs and interests are. So I think, for me at least, this has been a really substantive and engaging conversation. And I'd love for you to join me in thanking Valentina Fernandez, Shamina Merchant, and Meryl Swartz for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can go back to your seats. There's still like muffins and some pastries if you want to refuel after sharing fantastic insights. Let's give a round of applause again to our fantastic panel. So this is, I'm not going to say the most exciting part, because frankly the research itself is fantastically exciting, but we're very much looking forward to what happens next. And we hope that you all will be part of this process in a number of ways. But I want to first point out our beautiful studentvoiceindex.org website. which dives into the report in greater detail. Well, it shares the report in greater detail and calls out some specific stats. However, we also built a benchmarking tool. Based on our research, we identified really 10 different policies and actions and norms that institutions can adopt which correlate with stronger student voice based on our research. So based on those 10 metrics, we weighted them according to really how important they were to sense of student voice. And you can actually go online right now to studentvoiceindex.org and answer 10 questions, and we will spit out basically a number for your institution, which then compares how you're doing, how your institution is doing as compared to other institutions around the country. This is based on the research we did with this initial batch of more than 200 colleges and universities. If your institution was one of those institutions, we actually already have your results available. So you can go in and type in your institution. So if you're Duke or App State or a number of the many institutions will already have your results, but you can go in and adjust what the options are and see how that would affect sort of your benchmarking in comparison to the bulk of the institutions that we included. And really this speaks to not so much that we are here to provide all of the answers. We want to start a conversation. I think exactly the conversation that we just had with our great panel identified the opportunity to really build a strong relationship among the stakeholders involved in institutional decision making. But we also know these lessons don't stop at the campus level. We know that there's an application at system level decision making. We know that there's application at state level. We know that there's application at the federal level. In some cases, we see these items already in place. You look to federal, at the U.S. Department of Higher Education, negotiated rulemaking includes student representatives in that process. At the state level, you have in state statute the role for student representation in higher ed governance in states like Wisconsin and Florida. So we know that there are these pieces written into policy on paper at various levels of higher ed decision making, and we hope that as we really dive further into this research and those next steps, we can identify how to really bring student voice to life beyond strictly the policies on paper. And I think as was stated very well, is really looking at how do you build trust and the relationships and everything that happens between the meetings to really make sure that students are not just sort of added to different bodies or added to different committees, but really that their input is sought after on an ongoing basis, regardless of the issues. So we're very excited to also announce a few different partnerships that we're building. So, Lindsay mentioned the case studies that we have started to work on. We are building those into more comprehensive institutional partnerships. So American University and University of Cincinnati are the first two official partners. We're working on several more where we will conduct sort of 4 steps of activities to really take this national framework and this national research and understand better how this can do, how this can build progress toward inclusive student voice at the campus level. So first, we'll conduct a case study. We'll do the full assessment on trying to take into account some of the things that are on paper that aren't necessarily on paper, some of the formal and informal ways students are involved in decision making, both at the governing board level as well as some of the task forces and committees. If you have a university senate, what happens at the university senate and whatnot. And so we'll take all that into account and we'll produce a report with recommendations to your institution. And from those recommendations, informed by the trainings that we're already developing from our national research, we'll tailor some workshops for your institution, working with your institution leaders and student leaders on how to take what we found at your institution and work with you to really make sure that the key players are well versed in this subject matter and have a great sense of how to bring stronger student voice to life. And then finally, as was stated a number of times, communication is very important. So we want to make sure that the institutional leaders and the student leaders involved in these partnerships across the different campuses are talking to each other. So we have AU and UC talking to each other, and the many other institutions we'll include down the road. So if you are at an institution of higher education in the United States of America, we want to work with you. And so you can learn more about those partnerships, again, at studentvoiceindex.org. You can email us at info@campusleaders.org. And then I also am excited to share some of how we're collaborating with industry leaders and associations. We're working with, we have a formal partnership with ACPA, which is a big leader in student affairs. We are collaborating with ACE to identify ways to really strengthen student voice at that presidential and provost level of administrative leadership. And we're working with a number of other associations as well. AGB had a fantastic blog that they posted highlighting Student Voice Index a couple of days ago. So we're really looking forward to working with the higher ed industry at large to figure out really what is the future of student voice and how do we really work on this together. I think if there is nothing else that came out of this research, I think it is really this idea that it's really everyone's responsibility to bring student voice to life. We conducted this research to try to identify a clear roadmap, best practices, to better describe for institutional leaders how to successfully engage students in decision making. But on the other end, with student leaders, for all the student governments and student body presidents who are tuning in for this conversation, and others who will take a look at all of this later, it is also on you to listen to the students and make sure that the platform you have is inclusive and fully representative of the students that you represent on your campus. And that's what we're trying to do with these partnerships, is really do a deeper dive and understand how we can apply this as we look forward to future iterations of this research. So before we conclude the program, I just want to give a few I guess there are a couple housekeeping things. One is we have our full press release is available at the check-in table if you want to grab that and then go write all of your wonderful articles about Student Voice Index. And really, most importantly, I want to thank my team. And I want to thank the NCLC community for making this possible. So we got to hear from Lindsay, who led this research. She deserves a huge round of applause. And I want to thank Amy Smith, our deputy director. I want to thank Jordan Baker, our communications and advocacy manager. I want to thank Valencia Warren, who started 2 weeks ago at NCLC to really drive strong operations and bring, as a recent student leader herself, continue to bring that perspective to the team. I want to thank Peter Skipper, who's on our board of directors. We have Rini, we have Claire with our Campus Legacy Network. David Thompson is here as well, former student leader. So really, the work that we do together is what brings this to life. And to the student leaders, to administrators who are working together on strengthening student voice, I just want to say thank you for the work that you do. All of this means nothing unless you run with it. So you can go onto our website, studentvoiceindex.org. You can click a button that says Count Me In, and we'll follow up with you and figure out how we can best partner with you moving forward at your institution. And if you have other ideas for how we can do this better, we want to hear that as well. So thank you to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you to all of you for being here. And I'm happy to, we're ending a little bit early, so I'm happy to also take a handful of questions if there are any. And I'll probably direct most of them to Lindsay. Yeah.
Am I allowed to ask a question to some of our panelists? Or?
Sure, yeah.
I'm curious, or it could be anyone from the organization as well, because I found one of the things, at least in the press release, that was really powerful too, was this quote from Andy, and he talks about how while we see room to grow the overall sense of student voice, this research points to students as an indispensable stakeholder in better aligning student needs and institutional priorities and potentially preventing crises. And I really thought that piece about preventing crises and what you mentioned earlier about what's going on at Michigan State and all these other campuses is so important. So I'm curious from either the panelists or folks involved with the research that was done, do you find that institutions that operate more as a billion-dollar business have a harder time incorporating the student voice and preventing the crisis from happening? Because I find more and more, I make such observations, the campuses that treat themselves like a business rather than a community or a academic space are the ones who suffer from that, and we typically see it because there's a lack of transparency, things like that. So I'm curious, did you ever find that maybe even like the students from Michigan State or other campuses that have suffered from such crises made similar observations? Or do you have any thoughts? And I know Shamina, you also mentioned talking about it as a business, so I'd love if someone could add.
Yeah. So just to repeat the question for those of you who might still be online, and you are looking at the cameras here, you are welcome to log off as we move into the next part, and we can follow up with your questions if you email us or tweet at us, #StudentVoiceIndex. But the question is, basically, did we find, or is there a sense that particularly larger institutions that focus, as Rini, as you said, sort of operate as billion-dollar businesses, is there less transparency, less student voice? We can look more. We didn't look at institutional budgets as it relates to all of this. I think that's something that we're interested in for future research, is doing that level of analysis. I don't believe we found anything significant with relation to the size of the institution. Okay, great. I have the sort of general support of Lindsay on that statement. But the reality is, I think we had, even just on the panel with American University, how big is AU now? Like maybe 15,000 students total, including grad, and so so 15,000 students. And what about Ohio State? 52,000. So very different institutions. One is a major, flagship public. One is a fantastic private institution that produces the best alumni out there. But they have different policies on paper on how they integrate students into decision making. But I think sort of built into the question is, I think, a values question. How are we actually integrating and listening to students in the process? As you saw in the video for Ohio State, it really, as Sharon said, who's the chair of the steering committee on the University Senate, she said it's sort of just in the water there that they bring students in when there are tough decisions to make. And I don't know. I would suspect that it's hard to build. It's hard to codify that into policy. I think it's sort of a chicken or the egg kind of situation where did they respect student voices at the beginning and then they built policies that brought them in, or vice versa, they brought them in and then students rose to the occasion. And a lot of those changes at Ohio State happened literally 50 years ago. when they brought students into shared governance. So I think it's tough to answer that question specifically, but I do think it speaks to the culture that supports any policies that are on the books or not on the books. But I know, Shamina, you have your hand up.